About Agatha, the podcast all about Agatha Christie, in which we read all 66 of her mystery novels and attempt to rank them. This week, however, we are not reading a novel. We are reading a short story, The Mystery of Hunter's Lodge, first published in the Sketch magazine on May 16th, 1923. This is yet another Poirot short story, and let's dive right in.
This is a Poirot in which Poirot is actually not active in the investigation because our dear Hercule is in bed with a terrible case of influenza. This entire story is based on the idea that Hastings has gone out into the field and is reporting back to a bedridden Poirot.
And I would just like to briefly point out that having influenza as of May 16th, 1923 is no laughing matter. This would have just been about 5 years after the worldwide flu pandemic that, killed so many people. So we'll talk about the differences between the adaptation of this story and the story itself. But I think that's a big one in that there are very little hijinks having to do with Poirot being sick. It really is just a mechanism for him to be totally inactive and for Hastings to have to take the reins and for various things to result from that. But this is like he's seriously sick and he's out and that's it. And that's how it's treated in the story.
Right. And so the very first thing that we find out, other than the fact that Hastings has just recovered from influenza and that Poirot is quite ill, is that a very frantic gentleman has come for Poirot's assistance because his dear beloved uncle, he has just found out via telegram from his wife, has been murdered. So let us address our murder victim. He is one Mr. Harrington Pace, fantastic name.
That's a good name.
The owner of Hunter's Lodge, which is quote-unquote a small shooting box in the heart of the Derbyshire moors. And Mr. Pace was foully murdered by a close-range gunshot wound to the back of his head, presumably from a revolver, which has been conveniently loaded and mounted on the gunroom wall in which he was murdered. And yes, he's the uncle of the client who has come to Poirot, one Roger Havering.
And we should note that Mr. Pace's mother is an American, typically American in appearance, which I also highlighted when I read. I think Catherine and I both picked up on that. I'm not exactly sure what typically American in appearance
it
means.
Becomes a plot point later. Well, yeah, I don't know what it means either, but it becomes a plot point later.
Clean-shaven.
Yes.
I mean, there's the idea that Americans tend to be clean-shaven, but I feel like it's a bit more than that. I'm not exactly sure what.
No, and it's not the full meaning of that not spelled out. So we actually don't have any textual indication as to what that might be.
Lost to the sands of time, alas.
Right. And Mr. Pace is in possession of a great fortune. And he has been living with his nephew, Roger Havering, and Havering's wife, Zoe. But he has been sort of, I guess, I wouldn't say paying rent is the right word, but while he has been living with them, he seems to also be supporting them.
Right. So let's get into the suspects. We have Roger Havering, of course, and he is the second son of the 5th Baron Windsor, a bit of a prodigal son, which is why he has taken on his uncle, Mr. Harrington Pace, at his home. So again, not that the uncle is per se paying rent, but it's understood that he's supporting this somewhat ne'er-do-well nephew of his who's never really been able to quite keep it together. And then we have, of course, Roger Havering's wife, Zoe, and it is noted that before the war, of course that would be World War I, she acted on the stage under the name Zoe Camsbrook at the Frivolity, which is a London theater. And she's a very young and vibrant woman. And I'm very proud of myself that when that detail of her being an actress was just so casually dropped on like the second page of the short story, I knew that it would be significant.
We are not. So we are not yet to our clues. So let us continue through our suspects. Sure. We have 2 other suspects. We have the black bearded man.
Yes,
and he is the gentleman who has paid a visit to Pace immediately before his gunshot-aided demise. He's wearing a light overcoat, a dark beard, and he, quote-unquote, spoke like an American.
Which, I get what that means.
Right. Self-explanatory there. He's been let in by Mrs. Middleton, who is the Haverings' housekeeper and the sort of maintainer of Hunter's Lodge. And she's a middle-aged woman who dresses all in black, and she's been hired 3 weeks previously from a very respectable agency.
So those are our suspects. Short list for a short story. And let's just take a snapshot of the world as it seems to be before we get into the clues and deductions that lead us to solving this murder. Essentially, as we mentioned, Mr. Havering receives this very distressed telegram from his wife alerting him to the fact that their dear, dear uncle has been murdered the night before, and she tells him to seek out, only the finest help in a detective before returning to Derbyshire. So that is why Mr. Havering calls up Poirot. Of course, Poirot, being bedridden with the influenza, allows, for once, Hastings to accompany Mr. Havering back to Hunter's Lodge without Poirot. So Hastings is flying solo here. Be afraid. Be very, very afraid. Hastings does encounter our friend Inspector Japp investigating the murder when he gets to Hunter's Lodge. And we see the body. We see that it has indeed been shot in the back of the head with a revolver that was in the gun room and mounted up on the wall. And it seems as if the stranger who Mrs. Middleton, the housekeeper, let in was the one who did the deed. So the simple solution would be, let's figure out who the black-bearded man is who spoke like an American and who was let in by the housekeeper. Perhaps we will figure out who the murderer is.
We can quickly go through the clues because thankfully there are not very many of them and it's short. And so as Kemper mentioned, the first clue an astute reader should see. Like the very first clue is in fact...
For once I was an astute reader.
Congratulations.
I'm so proud of myself. For once I was an astute reader.
Kudos on that. It's on the second page and it's Hastings, in fact. They have a who's who that he pulls down from the shelf because Poirot can't get out of bed and he immediately wants to know who this client is waiting downstairs. And Hastings...
And Poirot loves his who's who, doesn't he?
Oh, my gosh.
He's constantly consulting that who's who.
Well, it's the Google search of 1923.
Right.
And so Hastings says basically I did recognize her. And so the very fact that he immediately recognizes his name as somebody who once played under a stage name and who was an actress, before the war... Any Christie reader should know that if someone is in any way identified as having been an actor or, enjoys a bit of panto or owns a dressing up box, chances are that is not to be overlooked. And chances also are that they might like dressing up in other times.
Exactly. So we should be very, very suspicious of this Zoe Havering from the get-go.
Never trust an actor in a Christie novel.
Never trust an actor. Never trust an actor in general, let's be honest.
That's not fair. I know plenty of very fine, decent people who are actors. Prejudices.
This is getting into more of an LA-specific conversation, perhaps. But anyway, so second clue, we get these very specific travel times by which Roger Havering takes the train. So a car comes from Elmersdale, which is a town near to Hunter's Lodge, to fetch Roger Havering in time for the 6:15 train to London. That train gets to London at 10:30, after which Roger Havering goes immediately to his club. So he couldn't be anywhere near Hunter's Lodge at 9 o'clock, which is when the bearded gentleman arrived. And, of course, soon thereafter is when the uncle was shot. So that feels like such a perfectly airtight alibi.
And Japp says as much.
It's just, that it's a little too perfect. We should be a little suspicious of that.
Right, and his alibi is completely confirmed by both the club and his wife.
Next clue, Hastings and Japp both meet Mrs. Middleton, who is the housekeeper again, in a dimly lit hall, and they don't take all that much notice of her other than as a somewhat frumpy middle-aged housekeeper. And here is perhaps the part where things go very differently than they would have if Monsieur Poirot were actually on the scene, because never underestimate the help.
Ever.
And Poirot knows that.
Don't overlook them ever. If somebody says they're the help,
Poirot knows that. We know that, or at least the astute reader knows that. Of course, Hastings doesn't know that because he's Hastings. So they just don't really take a close enough look at her.
Look being the operative word.
Yes, look being the operative word. And Poirot, even from afar, he's getting updates from Hastings. He immediately suspects that something is amiss with the housekeeper, and he's able to do that from miles away in bed, because that is the power of Poirot.
And what Poirot says is, tell Jap immediately to make sure that she doesn't leave the premises.
Right.
Of course, too late.
It's too late. By the time they get that message, the housekeeper is gone. She's missing. And they wonder, was she in league with this stranger who she let into the house? Is she in danger herself? They don't know what's going on.
No,
so,
and
final clue.
The final clue, is that we learn up front that Havering is rather poor. At least not as well off, certainly, as his uncle, which is why he's, sort of agreed to take his uncle in. And later on, we learn from Jap that, if it were not for Havering's, airtight alibi, he'd be completely suspicious. And Jap would have been on him immediately, because not only is he lacking in funds, but he has a history when he was a youth of financial scams.
Right.
So what do we know from that? Well, we know that airtight alibis are often suspicious, that his wife was previously an actress, that they are in desperate need of money, that they are supporting each other's alibis, and that their housekeeper is missing and possibly not a housekeeper at all, and that she was not sent from the agency that the Haverings said that she was sent from. So, I mean, pieces are kind of lining up. So the circumstantial evidence is lining up. Yeah, pieces are lining up.
Yeah, the ultimate deduction is that Mrs. Havering was posing as the housekeeper. They were never seen in the same place together to, throw suspicion away from them and onto someone else. And, Mr. Havering's alibi is airtight, because he was, in fact, nowhere near there, and he did not shoot his uncle. The person who shot the uncle was Mrs. Havering, because she was at the house in the guise both of as herself and this housekeeper who let in this supposed stranger. The only person's word we have for the stranger in the story is the housekeeper. But there actually was no stranger.
No, there wasn't. And also, the sort of frustrated ending is that both Jap and Hastings leave Hunter's Lodge knowing full well that all evidence is circumstantial and that there's absolutely nothing on the Haverings. And in fact, the Haverings are going to inherit all of their uncle's great wealth.
Money.
So, there's going to be no conviction. There's going to be sort of no justice done, except in an incredibly macabre turn in the last sentence of the sentence of the short story. We find out from Hastings that, it's actually okay that Jap couldn't find anything on them to be prosecuted, because, in fact, they were killed in a crash of an airmail to Paris, and, quote unquote, justice was satisfied. That is the end of the story.
The end. Yeah, so that is quite a reckoning, and I mean, I don't think we've read yet thus far a more kind of extreme version of extra legal justice being served, and it's this notion that really does complicate, I think, the model for murder mysteries, where the reckoning does not mean necessarily that law and order prevail. It means that some version of justice is done. And in this case, it is entirely a sort of moral, almost hand of God sort of thing, where these people who got away with, they evaded the law, but they got their comeuppance in the end.
Well, they got their just desserts.
They got their just desserts, and one would assume from some sort of divine hand. And just to, I did a tiny bit of research, just real quick, on this supposed plane crash, because again, the story is being written in 1923. Plane crashes in 1923 are a really big deal because hardly anyone was flying at that point, which is why it's even mentioned that it was an airmail flight, because most of the flying that was going on was actually for purposes of delivering mail and other freight. And there was this really famous air crash that happened in 1920, which is probably what she's referring to, because it happened London to Paris. And it happened basically, this plane lifted up in London, couldn't even clear 100 feet, crashed into a tree right off of an airfield. The 2 crew and then 2 passengers, so that would be the Haverings, burned to death in the plane, because the plane was so low. It's not like plane crashes nowadays where, right. I've been finding in general that in these Poirot short stories we've been reading, in like very different ways, the endings are often really abrupt.
Well, not just, they're very abrupt, and again, as I said before, I think like quite macabre.
Yeah, but we had that Hastings ending when Hastings was angry at Poirot.
And
remember that?
He slammed off and tries to
the door.
Revenge, basically. Like, he will figure out a way to show him. Yeah. I mean, I think Poirot and Hastings' lines before the end are a little bit interesting. Hastings, is really upset about the fact that they are not going to have any form of, legal justice. And he says, the wicked flourish like a green bay tree. I reminded him being Poirot. But at a price, Hastings. Always at a price. Croyez-moi. And it's like, I think Poirot does believe that, right? But at the same time, and we've seen Poirot do in every, one of these at some level. He has kind of done some sort of extra legal reckoning,
but in this one he kind of sits back and leaves it to God.
For God, or for essentially, the universe, however you want to evaluate that.
Yeah.
And
but I actually think he quite specifically is Catholic. I mean, he really does believe in a Christian God that I think does mete out justice, and like, this is probably the first time we're coming across it, but we will again. And it is interesting that at times he feels the need to almost play God and take matters into his own hands. At other times, he might leave it up. Yeah. At other times like this, this is a good example of him leaving it to, hands perhaps larger than his. But the idea and the fantasy remains intact that you do get, karma exists. You do get your comeuppance. You get your just desserts. Like, this is the nihilistic ending of this, of course, would be that they lived happily ever after. And it didn't matter.
I mean, if anything, more than, some sort of Catholic version, I think that Poirot actually sort of represents a little bit of an Old Testament-y, like, eye for an eye sort of system, like justice will be served.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing sort of charitable about his interpretation of people's moral failings. It's a little abrupt as a short story, and it's interesting to me largely because this will come up again. It will come up in some of the novels, but it's the little gray cells tested to their utmost, to the extent that Poirot is not given anything firsthand. He's not given any evidence that he can see. He's not allowed to interview anybody, and yet he can still piece the puzzle parts together, because that is just how his brain works. His brain, seeks to find the pattern or the solution in this. And
and it's the ultimate test for the reader, because he's given exactly everything that the reader is given. And I honestly have to say, like, there are some, like, we're not ranking this because it's a short story, but like, there are some Agatha Christie's where we've complained about the lack of, credibility, either in terms of how things happen or the way that, deductions are made, and that humans aren't acting like humans, or the leaps are just really extreme or require specialized knowledge. But in this one, like, it's all there. It's absolutely all there. Like, you could come to the conclusions that he comes to are valid, especially in that they're not even proven. He has no way of proving them, but it does make sense how he gets there, and the reader could have gotten there too.
Right. I mean, I think, it has a usual leap of deductive guesswork in that I don't think most people, unless you're looking for the clue, like as we've laid out, most people are not going to think like, oh yes, that lady in the house of the murdered man was also dressing up as other people. I mean,
Right.
this is the particular, suspension of disbelief there, but
I guess. I mean, there's been a murder. I mean, there's already a suspension of disbelief just given the fact that, this is like the 15th murder that we've and there's actually we can segue into talking about the adaptation because I could be reading into it, but there was a really funny moment when the first time Poirot is informed that there's been a murder. He almost has this look of like, oh, God, like again, come on, which, it's the suspension of disbelief of like, this man is just like, just insanely surrounded by murder. There's so many suspensions of disbelief that have to happen in this genre. But
no, it's true. But anyway. at least people are coming to him. He's not, he's not Jessica Fletcher. It's not like he shows up at a random place and all of a sudden people are dropping like flies around him.
Yes.
People do come to him for his assistance.
Well, that is one thing that's different between the story and the episode,
where it is a coincidence.
Where it is a coincidence because he happens to just be on a hunting party, and we can just get into the episode, which I actually quite enjoyed. It's the this is again the David Suchet series, and it's the final episode in the third season / series of the show, and it's quite a lavish production as always, and they really fill out the Hunter's Lodge and the surrounding moors, and it opens up on a hunting party that Poirot and Hastings are attending at Hunter's Lodge, and then in the course of the first day, Poirot being outside, of course, gets a chill and actually becomes ill. And it is treated much more comedically than it would be in the story. And there's a bit of sickness hijinks going on there, which David Suchet plays to perfection, as he always does. And then the murder happens and, the story takes its course. So it's not a complaint. I mean, that it's a slight weakness in that it is then a coincidence that he happens to be there. But it's another, this is another episode
it allows him to
that's very much fleshed out.
Right. It allows him to meet the principles that he never meets in the short story itself. And it's also, it's quite scenic at the beginning.
Oh, yeah. As always, we have, moors with the snow-encrusted moors and the beautiful bounding British dogs and, rifles and geese. And, the series is just very consistent with character traits, and they have to do a bit of convolutions sometimes to get Poirot to these set piecey scenes. It's like you could almost, I can imagine them in the writer's room, or, it's like one writer or two writers, but just saying like, how do we get Poirot to a hunting party? How do we get Poirot to, in Murder on the Links, they have that fun kind of like sporting town. And that one, Hastings basically hoodwinks him into it. And in this one, it's just because of a recipe that he's after. So like, I just appreciate the fact that they don't just plop him in and expect us to just kind of like swallow that. There's the characters never require a suspension of disbelief, which is which is lovely. Right. Definitely the mansion that they chose for it was also, in the story, Hunter's Lodge is described as a small gray stone building in the midst of the rugged moors, and it's basically pretty clear that it's sort of a dump. And in here, it's gorgeous, and this feast that they lay out for the hunters when they're coming back from that initial hunting party, just like made by mouthwater, and it's just like the typical sort of real estate and food porn that this series does so well.
The other thing that I would say that the adaptation does is that Harrington Pace comes off like a jackass, like pretty much from the beginning, whereas we, of course, don't see him at all, other than as a corpse on a slab in the short story.
Absolutely.
And so they make a big effort of making it seem like he's a man who could have many enemies because like he is an unpleasant person.
Yeah, like they create this whole other character of the gamekeeper at Hunter's Lodge is his half brother, illegitimate half brother, but he won't actually treat him. He treats him as a servant, and the brother's asking for money just to get married, and he won't give him money. So that's one person that hates him, and they make a lot of that. So they make him into a suspect. It's the padding out of suspects that we see in these adaptations of the short stories, which is generally done pretty well. I overall liked it. I think you, Catherine, were saying you had some issues with the way that they adapted this.
I thought it was charming. Let me put it that way. We actually meet the real Mrs. Middleton in this episode, Mrs. Middleton was in fact a person who was intercepted and paid off, which anybody who suffered through The Secret of Chimneys might recognize as a dual plot device in that work. Mm-hmm. The intercepting of somebody who has been sent to be a servant and then replaced by somebody else. I thought that scene, the interrogation scene with her, was very charming in a weird way.
Yeah.
And so, much of it is, like, very pleasant. I, like, enjoyed watching it enough. I think that my problem with it is, whereas the short story is a very nice little puzzle, the adaptation is far more ludicrous, in large part because we have to see much of it. This is one of the problems where, like, if you can off-screen things, they sometimes become at least somewhat more easily believed than if you have to actually
You didn't believe in Zoe Havering's disguise as Mrs. Middleton?
I did not.
I actually thought it was pretty well done. I mean, she girlfriend committed.
Yeah, she did.
To her disguise.
It's true.
She wore these like Coke bottle glasses, and then what I love is there's this scene, the final scene when Poirot, of course, gathers everyone together, which only happens in the episode and explains everything. We get a flashback to Mrs. Middleton taking off her disguise and becoming Zoe Havering. And her teeth are not, it's not just false teeth, it's like false gums.
Oh yeah,
also.
She went all
it's
out.
She went all out. Like it's an extreme kind of disguise. I agree with you. I think it was good for how inherently bad it is when you have to actually see someone disguised. I actually don't think we mentioned this on the record, but for The Man in the Brown Suit, the adaptation, one of the many sorts of ridiculous things in that adaptation was seeing Tony Randall, right?
Yeah, of course.
Seeing Tony Randall dress up as, just completely hamming it up as a woman in, various different women and Reverend Chichester. It's in the book, you can say, sure, the same man has been inhabiting all these different personas, but it's just so absurd.
Well, I mean, this is nowhere near that. But I mean, it's
that, and that's what I mean. I think it was done about as well as it could be done. I guess your point is that you still kind of cringed at it.
Well, it's not just that, but I mean, the sort of like essential confession towards the end, the trope of gathering everybody in a room. I actually liked that the story itself is like, well, yeah, we can't do anything about this. They're going to get away with it. And like, yeah, the only satisfaction you can have is that we know what happened, but that doesn't mean that we can do anything about it. There's a certain degree of bitterness about it in this,
and then watching and then reading about them dying
right, of course. But there's a certain degree of like very sort of cynical resignation. Like, yeah, sometimes people get away with terrible things and there's nothing to be done about it, that I actually sort of like in the short story, and it's so neatly, tidily resolved in the episode in this kind of typically over-the-top way.
I'm beginning to realize as we're going through these that, I mean, I think that obviously we have so many more mystery puzzle whodunits to go through, but Christie structures these, certainly the short story too. I think she almost probably looked at it as an opportunity to experiment a little bit. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of variety to the way that these stories are laid out, the way that they conclude. Right. Like, they're not the formula of, and especially, and I think just the most obvious and, let's be honest, cheesy part of it that sticks out to us is that gathering, the gathering of all the suspects and the reveal. That certainly is going to happen in a lot of her books, but it's not happening in a lot of these early ones all that consistently. And the structure of the stories, even though they're mystery puzzles, is more interesting than I think the adaptations would lead you to believe, because they really do follow that formula much more slavishly than she did.
When I was watching the adaptation, it was one of our rare rainy days in Los Angeles, or rainy nights. And so I was like snuggled up in a wool blanket watching some Poirot. And like, I remembered, it really was like a flashback to being a kid in, our snowy northern states, snuggled up in a blanket watching Poirot, and like, they had this sort of like wintry roasts, and it had a certain like, tucked in comfort level to it that really does not exist in the short story. And so, I mean, this was more of a juxtaposition than I think that we've seen, to me at least, between the short story and the adaptation, there was a harsher juxtaposition between what the short story was going for and where the adaptation went than I feel like I've seen in the previous ones we've been through.
And I appreciate what both of them are trying to do.
They're doing different
things. In the series, they're doing different things. I mean, the series clearly, again, they made the decision for consistency and comfort. It's all the same time period. It's all the same characters. They infuse all the stories with, the same cast of characters, which certainly wasn't the case in the short stories. Their aims are absolutely different. I mean, you can feel Christie already in the experimenting and pulling away from what she did at the beginning with Mysterious Affair at Styles, which was very traditional or would become the traditional model. I mean, I don't think she liked to be as tied down as she became.
No, I don't think
and
so.
The series, though, embraced that because the series is made for Christie fans, and they want that. They want what came to be recognized as the formula. And I don't think Christie ever wanted to feel like she was just writing a formula.
No, and I mean, I think that also we are now ending up in a weird timeline here because we have, a mass of short stories, but as we've previously noted, they were all written about the same time. And so we are going to keep interspersing short stories, and thus we're going to keep interspersing all of these episodes of Poirot that everybody is remembers as these beloved television episodes. We're going to keep interspersing those, except now we are getting far past them in where she's actually writing the novels. And I bring this up just because our next podcast will be one of the Christie greats, and talking about.
Well, we'll find that out when we rank it.
We will. I mean, we're saying that now, and I haven't read it in years, so.
I know. Maybe we'll read it and loathe it.
Maybe. I mean, it's possible. It's possible, and I mean, I think from an adaptation perspective, it will be interesting because it's going to run into some of the problems that we've just addressed about what you do with an adaptation where you have to see more than the story is letting on.
Right. On that note,
our next episode will be The Murder of Roger Ackroyd.
Yay!
I think we're both very curious to see how this reads after not having read it in a long time.
It's one of the classic Christies, and I feel like this is kind of the first classic Christie that we're coming across. I guess style is the first. It's kind of classic too, but we've been chugging through these thrillers, and I think I, for one, am excited to read a proper mystery puzzle.
And we're getting a Poirot that is in fact not going to be narrated by Captain Hastings.
All right, well, that is our episode for today. Obviously, next week we will be discussing The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, and in the meantime, we would love to hear from you as always. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find me, Kemper Donovan, at Kemper Donovan. You can find Catherine at Robcat, and you can always email us. We would love to hear from you at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. Please take a moment to rate and review us on iTunes or Stitcher, however you listen to this podcast. It would mean a lot to us. And you can also find us on Instagram at allaboutthedame.